Diane Francis, tell me a little bit about yourself. Where are you from, and where do you live these days?
Well, I'm originally from Chicago. I was born and raised in Chicago. I married a guy. We went to Canada. He was Canadian-British, and we went up to Toronto and had kids and a life and built businesses and did very well. So I am a dual citizen of the United States and Canada. I pay taxes, vote, work, and live in both countries. I love both countries. I've dedicated the book to both. And so I'm a merger myself.
The ultimate merger.
And I'm a businesswoman, a business professor, and I'm a business writer.
You've interviewed from, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan. Where did you start your career, and what led you to meeting and interviewing such amazing people?
Well, I'm a self-taught journo. I was good at English in high school. I thought I would like to be a novelist. When we immigrated to Canada, I was only 19. We started an art studio. I became a graphic designer with my ex-husband. So I got into business, and then I got involved when my kids were little in politics as a local political activist. And some of my friends who had gotten helped elected said to me, hey, it's your turn. Where do you want to be? Do you want to run for city council or school board? And I said, you know what? The power to change the world and influence events is not in the office, it's in the media. So I went to a community college. I took a couple of weeks night school. The guy said, you don't need this. There's a job at this little newspaper, and I think you should go for it. And they gave me a job. So that's really, it's all self-taught and very lucky.
What advice would you give somebody they're at the precipice of what you just described, of making a leap into writing or journalism or following their path some way? What gave you the confidence to go for it?
Let me tell you, what I've realized in the 5 years since I've written my last book is how hollowed out the media has become. There are no book reviewers in medium and small newspapers anymore. People are overworked and underpaid. The Washington Post, the Toronto Star, even the New York Times, they're down to a skeleton staff because they're fighting for survival against the blogosphere and the Internet. And so it's not a real great, journalism itself is not a real great career to hang your hat on. But learning how to write is, because it teaches you and forces you to think clearly, speak clearly, and write clearly. And that is extremely marketable. It's marketable in terms of government relations, public relations, and advertising, but it's also marketable because it gives you a skill set to think through things carefully and to cut through the nonsense. And so it helps you be a better decision maker if you master it. Not everybody does.
The name of the book is Merger of the Century. I'm talking, of course, to Diane Francis, the author. Why Canada and America should become one country. Before we delve into the book, and I've got to ask you, what was it like speaking or interviewing Ronald Reagan? What was that like?
This was when Reagan was actually, before he was the nominee, and just after he'd left the governorship, he was a life force. I mean, he comes from Illinois, which is where I come from. He was a sports broadcaster, good-looking guy. You know, he made everything look easy because he was just so talented and so darn personable, great sense of humor. I'm not saying he didn't take things seriously, but he had a lovely distance in life, which is probably why he lived a long, healthy life and did so well, because he just didn't get all caught up in stuff. Didn't have an easy childhood. We talked about the stepfathers, like Clinton, single-parent mom, alcoholism, overcame all of that and then some. And so, you know, real interesting guy. Loved him. Margaret Thatcher I had a special affection for. She liked me. I introduced her once on a platform in Toronto. She said, that's the best introduction anyone's ever given me. Would you like to come back after to the green room and have some scotch with me? I hate scotch, but I loved her. So we had a scotch, and then she invited me every time, open invitation, every time I was in London, and I was the editor-in-chief of the paper, so I was going to Europe a fair amount because the communist system was collapsing. It was a great story, and I'd always have tea with her and Dennis.
I just watched The Iron Lady the other day, so this is ringing very, very real life to me. So, well, that's terrific. All right, I've got to ask you, so the book, again, is Merger of the Century, and what is the typical reaction, if there is one, or you could describe it, what would be the typical reaction you've received thus far from an American, and then contrast that to an average Canadian?
Question. Well, in both cases, it's shock.
Yeah.
What? Are you real? Are you for real? With the Americans, I've found it's wow. They sort of gasp and they say, wow, what a neat idea. Because Americans all like Canada because they don't know much about Canada. Not that if they knew more about Canada, they dislike Canada, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So it's wow. And then about half of them will say, but why would they want to be part of our mess? So that's very interesting. And then I have my answer, and I say, well, if we joined forces with you, and that's a big if, we'd be 35 million Democrats. There'd never be a logjam in Washington again. So they laugh. In Canada, it's shock and horror for the most part. People are, well, wait a minute. And that's like, no way. And the knee-jerk reaction is, no way, no how, they'll eat us alive, we'll disappear, we think we have something important here, and on and on. This is exactly the same reaction. The benefit of being older is that I was around as a reporter and editor in the 80s when free trade with the Americans was first suggested by a very prominent liberal cabinet minister who'd been appointed to study what Canada should do and said the only hope for Canada economically is to do free trade with the Americans. He was thrown under the bus, and I saw that happen, and 2 years later the deal was signed. The free trade agreement was 87. That was Canada, the U.S. only. Mexico said, me too.
Right.
And then they signed on in 94, and that is the specific reason why Canada and the U.S. aren't in a situation like the Europeans where there's no border between us and we're much more integrated. Mexico's a problem.
You really think that we could be more secure with open borders between Canada and America? I mean, that you make that case that it could add security.
It could add security on a number of levels. First of all, the only way you can get rid of the border is if you combine your law enforcement, your homeland security, your immigration, your customs departments. So it means that everybody's letting in everything that everybody else knows about and agrees with. It helps in prosecuting, executing, and investigating. And there already is a lot of collaboration between the two countries. But this, of course, like Europe, once you eliminate the border, let's not forget, 28 countries in Europe who hated each other for centuries have no border. And they all keep their country intact. They're distinctive. They have their own tax, legal, healthcare systems, everything like that. So that's one of the things I argue in my book. You can either join full-on like Germany, East and West Germany, or you can do a European Union kind of thing. But we can't stay the way we are because Canada has a number of serious issues. First of all, it's economically dependent on the U.S. and has no say in the laws and what goes on in the U.S. Secondly, and I don't have to tell you folks in Alaska, we are sitting on the world's biggest buried treasure. Our northern territories are 3 times bigger than Alaska, and they're empty, and they've been neglected, and nothing has happened there. There's 7 mines. There's no rail, no seaports, no roads, no cities, and no exploration, no mapping. It's really quite unbelievable that all of this largesse has been left just sitting there empty. And you know what? China's targeted it. Russia's targeted the Arctic. Canada cannot do nothing with this land. And we can't develop it. We're not big enough. We don't have the money, and we can't defend it. Our Navy has 8,500 people in it. So we have to look at the geopolitical situation. And by the way, the United States needs Canada too. With all the resources, millions of jobs could be created building infrastructure and development in a sustainable way. And, I mean, it's just a win-win. From a business point of view, then there's the emotion. That's another story.
The emotional side of it is that American exceptionalism, and where would that go, and where would the rugged individualism and the sovereignty, the individual sovereignty that Americans feel, could that ever be something that is melded into this merger?
Well, my third chapter in the book, my first chapter is about how the world's changed, the geopolitical situation. Free enterprise is in a new Cold War. It's economic with state capitalism, led by China. These people know how to organize. They know how to get markets, resources, living standards. They are awesome. And their governments run the show. They run all their corporations. And they have all kinds of other weapons that they can use, economic weapons that our multinationals can't. And they're getting beaten, and they're going to get worse. So you've got that situation. The second chapter is about the border problems that now exist between Canada and the U.S. I mean, we had a free trade agreement 26 years ago between Canada and the U.S. Mexico came later. We should have gotten rid of the border by now. Every other country, 2 countries who have had free trade agreement, have gotten rid of the border within a decade. We're 26 years later, we haven't. Why? because Mexico has distracted everybody. And it's also like Americans think, well, we got to do something for Mexico too. Well, no, you don't. You just decouple it. They stay a free trade partner, and the U.S. and Canada goes on toward more integration. And so that's how you handle it. But politically, I think it's a little difficult. I'm already getting pushback from Hispanic press in the U.S. saying, whoa, 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 if Canada and U.S. merge, then Mexico's got to be included. And I'm saying, no, it does not. You cannot get rid of the border with Mexico, and we know why. Because their governments are weak and their living standards are low. So they're going to get somewhere eventually, and maybe they can join eventually, but I think it's two separate cases. And so that's the reason I talk about the merger, and the politics would be a nightmare, no question. But I think that this book has started to get people talking, and that's why I wrote it. I wanted conversations in the U.S., conversations in Canada. There was a recent poll in Toronto about the basis of this book. To Canadians, how many of you would agree to merge politically with the United States if you could get $500,000 or compensation thereof? And the amount of people that said yes was double the amount that had ever said yes in the last 30 years. It went from 20% to 40%. So it's not because of disloyalty. It's just that everybody knows we're slowly merging, that a merger is inevitable, that our only trustworthy traditional partner is the United States, and vice versa, and both of them could win.
What about the politicians in both countries that you've spoken to or had reaction to your concept that's in your book, Merger of the Century? What has been the actual elected politicians? What have the reactions been there?
Well, I called the Prime Minister of Canada and 3 of his cabinet ministers because I know them personally, and just to give them a heads up before the day of publication. And the Prime Minister said, "Oh, my." He said, "Well, we can't support anything like that, And I said, "No, I know that. That's not what this is about. This is about 20, 30, 40 years ahead, the existential problems facing the country. I just wanted you to know, and I didn't want anybody to accuse you of writing the book indirectly through me or any nonsense like that. That's not true." And he said, "Right." So it was thanks for the heads up. Good luck with it. Fine. Gave a copy of the book to Hillary Clinton at a conference, got a letter from her a week later saying, "Thought-provoking, interesting, thank you for the gift. Good luck with its publication." Jeb Bush, I gave a copy of it to him. He hadn't read it. He looked at the cover and he said, "Oh, my, oh, my. Now, isn't that interesting?" And I said, "You know what? The Democrats love it." And he said, "Why do they love it?" I said, "Because 35 million Canadians would be Democrats." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, not if there was a really good Republican in office. They become Republicans." So those are some of the anecdotal reactions. People are talking. Everybody in Canada who's interested in public policy are talking about it. Shows like yours are, pushing the conversation. And this is what has to happen. I don't have any investment in how it turns out. All I know is that we cannot continue to have a thickening border, and Canada will not be allowed to turn the country and keep the country a polar bear park. Forget it. Not going to happen.
The book is Merger of the Century, author Diane Francis, published by HarperCollins. Diane, fascinating, thought-provoking. It really is well written, and really, you're a fascinating person. I can't thank you enough for spending your time with me today.
Well, thank you for having me on.